Okay, so the first thing we wanted to talk about today, Emil, is NVIDIA again. They did their quarterly results, and once more, they beat estimates. So they have been on an historic tear. I think no company of its size has been growing this fast for this long. And investors have baked that into their estimates. And despite that, NVIDIA has beaten those estimates and just come in with a massive, massive quarter. So what do you think about that?
I mean, holy cow. Like, I don't know how, I mean, especially with a company where they produce something that's supply constrained. I don't know how they beat something that much more because I'm sure all these Wall Street people calculate how many chips can possibly be produced and they still underestimate it. It's really quite stunning. I don't know if they're surge pricing it or what they're doing, but what a juggernaut. I mean, to be worth $2.5 trillion, more than the entire German stock market,
Yep.
and to be up there now with Google, Microsoft, way above Facebook is really quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And then they have orders for years out. So just quite a story. It's sort of hard to comprehend.
And that's interesting that you say they have orders for years out, because I think one of the big questions, of course, is can it last? Is this the beginnings of a kind of a bubble? And I think one of the comparisons when I read other news, listen to other podcasts, is they talk about NVIDIA maybe being the Cisco of the AI wave, right? Which is like back during the dot-com boom, what happened is the internet itself, the infrastructure of the internet was growing. There were all of these startups, and no one knew what the future of the internet would be exactly, except that it would be big. And so a lot of investors just defaulted to saying, okay, Cisco is building the hardware that powers the internet. So no matter what happens, they can't lose. And in a sense, that was true, right? Cisco's still alive and kicking today, but they bid up the price of the company way beyond what it was worth. And basically, Cisco has never again reached its all-time high. It reached in like 2000 or whenever it was. And I guess the question is, every analogy breaks at some point. Like, how valid is this comparison to NVIDIA?
I guess I have less of a worry that we're trending toward an overcapacity problem like we did with the laying of fiber networks and
Mm.
the need for routers like we did in the Cisco internet days. And more of a worry that just the valuation itself, even if all the orders came in, just assumes sort of a curve that would be hard to imagine in almost any scenario when you look 5, 7 years out. Like to
Yeah.
go from a couple $100 billion company to 2.5 trillion in less than a year just feels like bubblicious. And
It does. I mean, it's the third most valuable company on earth now.
I worry about the valuation, not necessarily that they're overbuilding capacity like they overbuilt fiber networks for the internet and all the other stuff. But yes, the Cisco analogy is an interesting one to think about. The other difference here is like my understanding is there were other router companies that were technologically behind Cisco, but not as far behind as the difference between NVIDIA and the next best provider of what they do.
There are a few interesting questions baked into that, right? So first of all, yes, you talk about the valuation, and the earnings multiple I think is around 45 at the moment for NVIDIA, which is higher than Google, higher than Apple, way higher than the overall stock market. So that implies, yes, continued explosive growth. Will that happen? Then there's a question of how deep their moat is, as you say, Emil, and it's for someone who's outside that really deep tech of that industry, it's hard to tell, but the consensus seems to be, as you say, Emil, that it's fairly deep and it will take a while for anybody else to catch up. But the other question for me, as you point out, you say you don't think there's going to be the overcapacity. And that's less clear to me. It's a bit of a gold rush right now. And the question is how much processing, how much compute is necessary to bring valuable commercial outcomes to AI? There's a couple of reasons why I'm not convinced that there won't be that overcapacity problem. The first is that AI is becoming more computationally efficient at the software layer, right? There are better training models that's being optimized. There are better compilers. And so even just compute for compute, you can train a model more cheaply than you could a year ago. The second thing is models at any given size are becoming more effective. So there's all this like software layer optimization that's happening. And then the third thing is it's not that clear that everywhere that AI is being rolled out will actually deliver value. And so there's a possibility that some companies, especially more traditional, less sort of tech-forward companies, might actually pull back on their AI investment. And so I do think there's a sense of like everything has to keep going right for NVIDIA to stay airborne like this. And it's just not clear to me how much AI capacity is needed.
I agree with you on the software optimizations. There's going to be tons of optimizations for sure. Let's like bake that in. The difference in the first internet wave it was highly speculative based on people using the internet at a pace that they thought was going to be greater than it actually turned up to be. This side is a little bit more marketplace, meaning one could argue the more compute capacity that's available, the more sophisticated applications that people will deploy that do deeper, more interesting stuff. Whereas before it was just like server capacity, like launching internet sites. The complexity of the site didn't sort of change based on capacity, where the number of GPUs you have available might determine how sophisticated the applications you can serve consumers are. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, it might. And I think that's an interesting question. So you talked about the fiber build out in particular, which is really interesting because internet speeds have become an interesting thing where when internet was 10 megabit, people would say, you'll never need 50. When it was 50, people said you'd never need 100. When it was 100, people said you never need a gigabit. They were wrong until they were right. Like, I don't think anybody needs home 10 gigabit networking, right? It doesn't seem to make a difference. So you kind of top out where you're like, we have that consumer surplus. We have as much as we need. I know it's ironic, Emil, right now, my internet connection's a bit flaky, but the truth is if you've got gigabit fiber, you are good. You've been good for the last 10 years. And so is there an AI or a GPU equivalent of that where it's like, you're a big company, you've got access to whatever many GPUs and that'll do for your use case? Or, as you say, is it a question of, or a case of more is better nearly indefinitely? The more compute you have to throw at this, the better your models. And I don't know enough.
We're certainly not at that plateau now.
No, we're not. We're not. Absolutely not. I think the question is how much growth is baked in, right?
Right. And if there's robots running around your house in a few years, you may need more than a gigabit at home. Like, again, it's hard to predict the future here, but we're like at the very beginning of the AI revolution. And at least at this moment, even when you hear from the safety people who left OpenAI, one of the complaints was they couldn't get enough allocation of compute, right? This is one of the biggest AI companies in the world that has access to Microsoft Azure. Now, this is very early days, but like if they have a problem getting compute, how much does that trickle down to everyone else in the world? And that's like with a whole bunch of countries in the world that haven't yet even started.
I'm somewhat playing the devil's advocate. I think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in a sense, a $2.5 trillion valuation is an extraordinary claim by the market about the ongoing value of NVIDIA and AI. And so it's like, wow, a lot of things have to go right to justify that. But like it is an incredible story, an incredible corporate story of incredible execution, great timing, great strategy that finds NVIDIA where it is. So, fair play to them. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, look, if it was as easy to analogize historically, this looks like that, so be wary. The stock would sort of incorporate that into its price, right? In theory.
Yeah.
So
in theory,
it comes down to an opinion, and I think it's helpful to look at the analogs, but not determinative. And when I look at the analogs, I feel that it's different because my belief is that the computational power is a limiting factor on innovation right now in a way that I didn't feel that was the case back then.